Good morning, everybody. It's for me a great pleasure to introduce Rémi Parmentier to finish our environmental lobby class with his lecture of today. As previously described, Rémi is a key person on the environmental movement for the last quarter of a century, even more. I have to say, he has been on the peak of the wave of most of the environmental issues that range from whaling, toxic waste, illegal fishing, so on. And I think he has a great perspective. I have enjoyed a lot to share with him the times where we have been able to coincide, and I hope you enjoy the class as much as I enjoy his perspective. So welcome, Rémi, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you all. It's great to be here. I think it's a second or maybe even the third time that I do something here in this building. It was about approximately 10 years ago that I think I was asked to introduce a book. Maybe it was the first book on sustainable development that was published by this institute or institution, and since that time things have evolved a lot, and I am very impressed to see in the walls of this institution, in the corridors, a number of references to environmental responsibility, corporate social responsibility, and so forth. So great. Thank you, Anna, for the invitation. I have coincided with Anna on a number of occasions in intergovernmental fora and elsewhere, and I think you are very lucky to have Anna as one of your professors. So I'm coming here to, I've been asked by Anna initially to talk, she said, talk about lobbying. And I said, I don't talk about lobbying. I don't use the word lobbying. I think it's a word that I don't like. I like to talk about political campaigning. I come from a very specific and personal prisma. On the photo in black and white here, the man with the long hair and the beard is not somebody in the backstage of Woodstock or back in the 1970s, or it's not a member of the Bader-Meinhof gang, also in the 1970s. It's me. Also in the 1970s, obviously, around the time when we first bought and operated a boat that became famous and became a sort of myth. That was the Rainbow Warrior back in the 1970s. So my prisma comes from a very specific experience. I spent, I think, some 25 years in a leadership position with Greenpeace until the Johannesburg summit of 2002, the Summit on Sustainable Development, 10 years after the Rio summit. And after that, 25 years, I said, well, it starts to be to be good, and I moved and created together with a couple of colleagues a consulting organization which is called the Varda Group, with which or through which we provide strategic advice and strategic programs to a whole range of institutions and organizations. So in fact, because I started being involved in environmental issues back in the 1970s, in the mid-1970s, you said a quarter of a century. It's much more than a quarter of a century, actually. It's a long time. I am much less prepared than you, because you have many more opportunities, you as students interested in sustainable development and environmental issues than there was at the time. We had to make it up on the way, whereas you have opportunities such as this masterclass that you are doing. To give you an idea, the World Biodiversity did not exist when I started to campaign for biodiversity. The word sustainable development, did not exist as such. That goes back to 1987, the Brundtland Report, as you know. So basically, what I'm sharing is based on a very down-to-earth experience more than an academic experience. And it's a bit of a paradox that now I am invited to provide input to academics such as you. So it's an honor for me to be with you here today. People tend to say, especially people in the activist world, they tend to say, well, you had it really easy, Rémi, because you were with Greenpeace. So Greenpeace, really famous, really, it had a lot of charisma. It was easy for you to start. Well, I like to use this press clipping from Spain, which is, I think, from 1980, which says that Greenpeace will prevent whaling, will take the rainbow warrior and prevent whaling. I think that was already a couple of years after we had started, and still you can see, and that's a mainstream newspaper. That's not a small thing, and they did not have, they did not write Greenpeace right. They were saying Green Price, right? At that time, we still, and that was already several years after we'd started, we'd have to explain what Greenpeace was. I would take my phone and say, hey, I'm calling from Greenpeace. We're a group of guys who are trying to protect the ocean, and we have a boat. It's called the Rainbow Warrior. Do you want me to spell the name? That sort of thing, right? And they would even spell Greenpeace wrong. So it was very much, creating things as we were going along, and it was not the perception that it was easy for us because of the fame of Greenpeace. Well, the fame, we built it on the way. It did not start overnight. Let me tell you the story of Alex and Ines. These are two people two young people, of your generation, who worked with me. Well, Alex presently is he is not working with me, but he's worked for many years with me. And Ines, the lady here, is working with me, has been working with me for, I think, 2.5 years. And they are like you, they're your generation, and they've studied a big deal of environmental policy and sustainable development and all of that. They've got masters and all that sort of stuff. But one thing that they did not, they never learned when they were doing their university studies was advocacy. And like maybe some of you, I'm sure like some of you, they became interested in environmental issues and decided that they wanted to specialize in environmental policy because they were attracted or inspired by people doing environmental advocacy, what Anna calls environmental lobbying. But yet nobody teaches them how to do it, to actually do advocacy. So this is the idea of this class that I'm sharing with students, and and members of advocacy organizations in training courses in many places around the world, and I'm happy to try to share that with you to fill what I call the advocacy gap. I may be wrong, and you may tell me, well, here we do advocacy now, we learn advocacy, but if so, then you'll have to compare what I'm going to share with you with what the academic professors will have taught you. And advocacy, again, Anna initially told me, I want you to teach them lobbying, and lobbying is really only one aspect of advocacy, and I think we need to look at lobbying in the wider context of what I call political campaigning. When I started, the world was very different. So you can see the title of that slide, you know, it says changing world and changing the world, you know, the square brackets are trying to portray the two meanings. This book, I was stunned. About 2 or 3 years ago, my son, who must be your age roughly, gave me for Christmas a book that is called Photos That Changed the World. And he obviously had not read the book. He probably went to La Fnac very, you know, at the last minute on the 24th of December, saying, what the am I going to find for my father, and give him the impression that I care for him. And he found that book, and I opened the book, and poof, one of the photos that changed the world was a photo of a campaign that I actually was very, very, very intimately involved in. And it referenced an international treaty, the OSPAR Convention, which Anna has probably mentioned to you during your classes. It mentioned a milestone in environmental policy that we in my days in Greenpeace, triggered in the framework of the OSPAR Convention. That was the prohibition of the dumping of industrial wastes at sea, radioactive waste at sea, and obsolete offshore oil and gas installations that also the industry wanted to dispose of at sea instead of recycling. So I found it interesting to see that together with that's Martin Luther King, right? There would be a photo that would and that would reflect something that we did to change the world. And what changing the world means, it means to transform problems into solutions. To move from problems to solutions. And in the case of ocean dumping, I think it's a very interesting case. We moved. Ocean dumping was of industrial wastes at sea was a problem, and we triggered concepts that became known in the contemporary jargon, such as corporate social responsibility, the precautionary principle, the ecosystem approach, and so forth. And now, through the prohibition of dumping at sea, we indeed were able to promote a safer disposal and recycling and waste avoidance policies which otherwise would not have existed. Oops, wrong button. So changing the world and changing world again. Another example is these the work that other works that we carried out at sea, and my mind was totally blown. about 3 years ago, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, I was in La Coruña in the north of Spain, and I visited the Maritime Museum of, I think it's called the Maritime Museum. Anyway, it's probably Maritime Museum of La Coruña in Galicia. And I ran into this harpoon gun that was the exact harpoon gun that this is me. I think 35 years between the two photos. The same harpoon gun that in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean we had been stopping years back, back in the in the very late 1970s or in 1980, something like that. And in those days we were saying harpoon guns should end up in the museums. That was the slogan. And my mind was totally blown when I discovered that indeed this very same harpoon had ended up in a museum. And by and large, all harpoon guns, with very few exceptions, have now ended up in the museums. This is an example of really how perhaps not only you can change the world, but perhaps you as individuals, well-prepared individuals, can change the course of history. The climate politics, we're in the thick of it now. I don't know what you're planning to do in November, in a few months, when the COP21 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is going to meet in Paris. I don't need to recall you that it's going to be the make it or make it or kill it meeting, right? So I have a 2 hours version of this presentation, and I have a 5 hours version of this presentation. This weekend I sent the 5 hours presentation version to Anna, and she said, "Oh, this is great, Rémi, it's going to be good." But then I showed it to Ines, this lady who works with me yesterday, and she said, "Rémi, this is not the 2 hours version. You're going to go on and on and on, and it's not going to work, or you're going to go so fast that you'll lose them." In addition, she said, because she's done the sort of masters that you've been doing, she said, well, don't go too much into the details of the history of environmental policy, because it's a master's class on environmental policy, so they should know it all. So I have shortened this section about the international sustainable development, the politics of international sustainable development, to allow me to perhaps give you a vision that is not repetitive of what Anna and others have already told you. Ines may be wrong, because Anna thought it was an interesting presentation, but I think when we are looking at when we're looking at environmental policy, we have to look at where we come from and where we are going, and that's what I'm trying to do. But I'll do it in a concise manner. And what we're going to do is look at the context first, and then look at the perspective. So the context, it's like looking in the rear view mirror. But we'll do that relatively briefly, as I said, and then we'll look ahead, the road ahead, and we'll try to look at some of the challenges on the road and maybe some of the roadblocks. So the context, rear view mirror, right? So I think, as you know, modern environmental policy, I think we can say started in 1972 in New York, in Stockholm, with the first UN conference on the human environment in June 1972. And it is because of this beginning in 1972 that then later, 20 years later, 1992, we had the Rio Earth Summit that was a new departure on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the first Stockholm conference. Then we continued with the Johannesburg summit of 2002, and more recently the so-called Rio +20 conference in 2012, right? Well, this is one way to tell the story of environmental policy. There are many other ways, and actually the perception is influenced by each individual's experience, and also cultural and political and geographical regional backgrounds, of course. I'm sure that, you know, our friend from China has a different perception than, where are you from? From Kenya, for example, and that's, I'm from France originally, and I'm from France, and as I already said, I'm older than you. So for me, in my case, I think I can say that the first awareness, the first environmental awareness dates back to 1967. The Torrey Canyon. Do you know what the Torrey Canyon was? What do you teach them, Anna? The Torrey Canyon was the first super tanker to crash in the Atlantic Ocean in Europe on the coast of Cornwall, and to create a major oil disaster. Back in 1967. I was very young. I was younger than you now. But for me, I think that was what it was, what made it. Others, well, it could be, especially in the US, many people of my generation talk of Silent Spring, the book by Rachel Carson. That was the first popular book to question the wisdom of using organochlorine pesticides in the environment. Silent Springs, spring referred to birds are disappearing, are vanishing, right? We will not hear the songs of the birds. And here you have a book in French. That was my second awakeness. To environmental, not awareness of environmental issues perhaps, but the awareness that we could do something about it. That was a book by an agronomist, a French agronomist, who was working in the third world, essentially. His name was René Dumont, and he wrote a book that was called L'Utopie ou la mort, that's Utopia or Death. And now, 40 plus years ago, I find it interesting to recall Utopia or Death, because I think now it's the reverse. It's those who thought, those who were called utopians, the environmentalists, are really those who have their feet on earth. And those who are utopians are those who believe that we can continue to emit greenhouse gas the way we do, the deniers of the environmental crisis, those who object or drag their feet to the need to create a world that is more equitable, including intergenerational equity and so forth. So I think there is a mind shift nowadays. The utopians are those who thought they were the realists, and I don't mind being called, having been called an utopian, but now when I meet with, or I dialogue or argue with a climate change denier, I tend to tell him that he's the utopian. So that's when it started, the early 1970s, and as I mentioned, it brought us to Rio plus 20, and it was a very long journey with a long set of roadblocks that that you are familiar with. Now, 40 years after Stockholm, and a couple of years, 2-3 years after Rio plus 20, I'd like to share with you what I took home from Rio plus 20 as someone who has participated in the majority of environmental summits and as a non-state actor in many of the environmental treaty negotiations that have taken place between the 1970s and today. First, I think there is a positive development, which is a sign, and that's a paradox, a sign of the seriousness of the environmental crisis. We're talking everybody's talking of planetary resilience. It's becoming a mainstream issue. As I mentioned before, there is an issue of environmental security. Well, it goes beyond that. It's planetary resilience. That was a word that was an expression that was hardly used, and certainly used in a very, very small microcosm. Now it's becoming mainstream. Before the Rio plus 20 conference, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, asked a so-called panel of eminent persons, that's the jargon of the United Nations, to come up with some suggestions about what could be done at the summit. For a variety of reasons, I don't think many people read the report, and I don't think that many of the heads of state and government who came to Rio actually read it seriously. But it is a very good read, because it really sets the tone for the challenges of planetary resilience. So that's my first take home. We are on a fight for planetary resilience. Second, Rio plus 20, one of the major decisions, or one of the interesting decisions that was taken as part of the outcome document, the Rio plus 20 declaration, which is known as, let's test. How is it called? I'm just checking if you're a good teacher, Anna. The documents that came out of Rio plus 20. It's called The Future We Want. Oh, you were going to say it. Yes, good. Our friend from Africa, always Africa leads. Good. The document, The Future We Want, which is not necessarily the future we need, but there are elements of it. Through this document, it was decided that the United Nations should adopt a set of so-called UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these development goals are being negotiated now. Well, they've been negotiated already for throughout the last year, 2014, and it's continuing now. And next month we'll be in New York again to discuss the indicators that will match the targets and the goals that are being selected. Personally, I'm working essentially on the goal for the ocean, because it's very much my thing for a variety of reasons, and we've been campaigning to make sure that this time the ocean would have a so-called standalone goal, because after all the ocean represents more than 70% of the surface of the planet, and it is a wildlife support system. Without the ocean, well, forget sustainable development, forget life on Earth, actually. So the Sustainable Development Goals are going to succeed to replace the so-called UN Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. I'm sure that, you know, yeah, I see you nodding. You know that the United Nations in the year 2002 adopted the UN Millennium Development Goals, which had a few references to the environment and to sustainability, but very few. It was more about other sort of equity issues such as education, public health, and so forth. But it's interesting that you know the MDGs. Like I say MDGs and you understand that acronym. Probably not all the acronyms that I'm using you are familiar with and the lay persons are familiar with. So now remember this one, SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. For the next 15 years, sorry, for the next 15 years until 2030, everybody is going to talk of the SDGs that should be adopted by the heads of state and government of the countries members of the United Nations in September of this year, in order to start a process of implementation and promotion of these goals and targets between 2016 and 2030. These are so-called soft law, right? It's not like treaty negotiations. It's more in the category of voluntary agreements. But because of the visibility that they are receiving, it can be an opportunity to trigger resources and to give visibility to certain issues that otherwise are buried into the plethora of societal issues that the world is confronted with. So one of the issues is, of course, one of the issues that is at the heart of the sustainable development debate is the issue of the sustainability of our production and consumption patterns, of course, which are driving the environmental crisis, and if they are modified, can drive the way to the solutions. You must remember, well, you were not born probably, but or you were very young, but you have heard that in 1992, when he came to Rio, to the first Rio summit, George, you're smiling. How old were you? 10. 10. Okay, that's good. Yes. You're not going to say. Well, it's good. Youth is good. George Bush. You've heard of George Bush? Yeah. But you know, he had a father. You know, the first one, George Bush. In 1992, he was the president of the United States. And he came to Rio. He was forced to come to Rio. He dragged his feet. And unlike his son, who did not come to the summit in Johannesburg, George Bush father, to his credit, a bit at the last minute, but to his credit, came to Rio. But when he came out of the plane, the first thing he said was, the lifestyle of the United States is not up for negotiations. That's a And that was to say that, oh, we're not going to change our consumption patterns. And this debate has continued after Rio for the following 20 years, and there was an effort to try to set up a so-called program on sustainable consumption and production, and that was always blocked by the United States. But in Rio Plus 20, finally, with a different US administration in place, it has been agreed to launch a so-called 10-year program on sustainable development, on sustainable production and consumption. I'm not suggesting that the fact that there is some bureaucrats in some buildings that belong to the United Nations is going to change overnight the unsustainable consumption patterns that characterize the environmental crisis. But yes, the fact that there has been a consensus to address it and to address the inequity that that entails unsustainable production and sustainable patterns is a step in the right direction. Another take-home thing from Rio Plus 20 is the fact that the ocean, I care very much for the ocean, both personally and professionally. The ocean has been given a very important place for the first time. The ocean, it's a paradox. In Rio 92 and in Johannesburg had been given a fairly modest place, so to speak. And it's a paradox because, as I already mentioned, the ocean is a life support system. No ocean, no life. No ocean, we're not here. It's, you know, there is no life on Mars, on planet Mars, as far as we know. There is maybe some thing will be found in somewhere, but I don't even think so, no? Like some worms, or not even worms. No, there is no life, what we call life, on Mars or because there is no ocean, right? And so if we do not look after the ocean, especially the fact, after the fact that the ocean is mitigating climate change, then we might as well kiss this planet goodbye and kiss each other's goodbye. So for the first time, a significant part of the document, the future we want, is dedicated to the ocean. It's actually the largest section of the document, of the substantive part of the document. So this is very encouraging, and as Anna has probably told you, because she was in New York recently, so was I, we have made a significant step forward towards the implementation of the Rio Plus 20 commitment on the governance and conservation of the high seas, this area of the ocean which is beyond national jurisdiction. You know that coastal states have an area of 200 nautical miles, which is called the economic exclusive zone, and then beyond that there is the high seas, which represents 64% of the whole global ocean, and 45%, no less than 45% of the entire planet. So it's very important to protect this repository of life that at the moment is insufficiently managed and and looked after. So the ocean, very important. And let's see the next summit, the Earth Summit, as we call it, in 2022, maybe will be the Ocean Summit, who knows. Beyond GDP, do you know what GDP is? Yes, you know. An acronym that we all know. It's interesting because economic acronyms, everybody, acronyms that belong to conventional economics, everybody knows them much more than acronyms that belong to environmental economics. So it's about how we measure wealth, right? And in Rio, at Rio Plus 20, there was a consensus that we have to stop measuring wealth just on the basis of GDP, of the gross domestic product. But there are other elements of wealth, including ecosystem services, biodiversity, natural resources, etc., that are at least as important, because without natural wealth, you cannot create artificial wealth. Without nature, you cannot make money. Without an environment that is productive, I mean. That's very simple. I think that also in Rio there was a recognition of the limitations of voluntary partnerships, and that there was a need to reinforce legally binding measures and agreements internationally. And finally, last but not least, and that's what that photo is about with this young person that we brought to Rio Plus 20 and who addressed the heads of state and government at the opening of the summit. There is a new generation. I call it, you know, you have these names that I'm not exactly sure what they really belong. I read in the newspapers the Generation X, the Generation Y, the Generation Z. I'm not sure which one you guys belong, X, Y, or Z, but I like to talk of the SD generation, the Sustainable Development Generation 2.0. You were roughly born, looking at you, together with sustainable development. You know, 1987, the Brundtland report, Our Common Future. This is roughly when you began, right? And now you are moving on the stage. So you're the Sustainable Development 2.0 generation. And if I was you, I would be very angry with my generation. Because when you were born, the governments that were in place, the heads of state and government that were in place at the time, in Rio in particular, promised you a future. And the truth is that your future is much more gray than the future of my generation. So you can also be angry at me, and we'll come back to it, because I did not do necessarily a good job in campaigning for the environment. So I said what I take home from Rio. What I was missing in Rio is the fact that we are struggling, I think I already mentioned it, we are struggling against an effort of demolition of the environmental policy edifice. And this is what is preventing us to add stories onto the edifice. And I think it's a deliberate strategy of certain industrial sectors to try to demolish the environmental policy edifice. And we have to be much more forceful in that regard. the responsibility of civil society organizations is also something that I see missing. The responsibility is collective, and it's also a responsibility of civil society organizations. There is someone, an ambassador, I'm not going to tell you from which country, an ambassador once a few years ago was telling me about what he was calling the United Nationization of the NGOs. And I think what he was trying to come to was that non-governmental organizations were tended to become very, a number of them were very conventional or mainstream. And it is their responsibility to shake and to make waves in order to accelerate the road to sustainable development. It's an issue, the accountability is shared by all. Another thing that I saw missing in Rio is that yet we have not managed to tackle the fact that we are supporting, we as taxpayers, we as public institutions, we continue to support environmentally harmful activities through harmful subsidies. It is a paradox that more than 20 years after the adoption of the Climate Change Convention in 1992, we continue to give public money to the fossil fuel industry, for example. It is true for other issues, and I'll come back to it. Green taxation is another issue that we're not coming to grips with yet. It's very simple. It's green taxation. What is it? You hurt the bad guys and you help the good guys, to be very, very simple, right? Where this is still missing in the government's agenda. And last but not least, perhaps, I think that more attention should be paid to the role of advertisement, especially the advertising industry, especially in promoting and encouraging unsustainable production and consumption patterns. And it's quite extraordinary that there is a resistance to control the advertising industry, which is one sector that fuels unsustainable consumption patterns. So, looking at this context, or taking into account this context, having looked in the rear-view mirror, what do we have ahead of us? What's on the road, and what are the what can we expect ahead of us? When I talk of sustainable development, I see that slide is not updated because I've put plus 20. It's an old slide that talks of 28 years since the concept started. I always refer to this chair that was designed by Picasso, which you can find in the Picasso Museum in Paris. I think it describes the problem with sustainable development. If you try to sit on this chair, you're going to have a problem, obviously. And I think that's the problem with sustainable development, that the different pillars are not equal, or are not given equal importance. As you know, the sustainable development is made up of the economic pillar, the social pillar, and the environmental pillar. But a different weight is given to the three pillars. And fourth, it's easier to sit on a chair with 4 pillars rather than 3, obviously. And perhaps we should think of a cultural pillar. and so let's talk of the environmental pillar. Let's focus on the environmental pillar. Well, first, something positive is that I think that now nobody is arguing that the environmental pillar is a luxury for the Western middle class. 20 years ago, there was people who were still believing that this was the case. It's no longer the case. Even more so, the environmental pillar is widely recognized as a tool for poverty eradication. The ecosystem approach, in particular, it is when we're thinking of issues such as access to water and others. It's a tool, therefore, for equity, and it's a tool for justice, for social justice, for regional justice and equity in the globalized economy in which we live. And it's, of course, a tool for intergenerational equity. As the saying goes, there is no planet B, right? It's a bit depressing to think that we're still arguing that there is only one Earth. In 1972, one of the seminal books that was published around the time of the Stockholm Conference was a book called Only One Earth. And I saw a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, around the time of Rio Plus 20, someone published another book that was called again Only One Earth. But there is no planet B, and as you know, our consumption patterns at the moment suggest that if we continue to consume the planet the way we do, by 2050 we'll need a couple more planets. So that's clearly insane. Solutions. Well, we need to give visibility to emerging solutions, such as renewable energy, for example. We need to promote win-wins, and we need to anticipate challenges. For example, yesterday, you may have noticed, we're here in Madrid. Have you noticed that there was an earthquake? Yeah, you noticed it? Anna seems to be. You did not notice the earthquake around 5 o'clock? Yeah. So the earthquake and the epicenter of the earthquake was exactly in an area where they've given licenses for fracking, for extracting oil and gas through this technique that is widely known to enhance earthquakes, right? And so I'm not suggesting that yesterday's earthquake was due to fracking, but I think this is an example of anticipating new challenges and not repeating the same mistakes that we are committing. The extraction of oil in the Arctic, which is also a major global issue at the moment, is another example of anticipating new challenges. I've already spoken of the consumption patterns. I think there is something else that is. I've mentioned the consumption patterns and the green taxation. I did not mention until now liability for environmental damage. I think this is an issue that you have discussed within your or reviewed within your master class. It's quite simple, right? We should stop admitting that the private sector can collect the benefit and share the costs with the rest of society. We need to internalize and not externalize environmental costs. Renewables. I think this is a case, a very good example of a success story that needs to be said and that needs to be enhanced. This photo is a poster that was published around 1975 or 1976 in Paris, Énergie Libre, the free energies. That was a visionary exhibition, one of the very first exhibitions that was ever made at the Pompidou Center in Paris. Just when the Pompidou Center was created, some visionary guys decided to imagine the future with renewable energy. Of course, they were considered, or we were considered, utopians at the time, but now this has become a reality. This photo of these stairs I took in Brussels a few years ago at the Congress of the European Renewable Energy Council. As you see, they're projecting in Europe, within Europe, 45% of renewable energy, of all energy consumed and produced in Europe, to be 45% by 2030 and to be 100% in 2050, 100% in 2050. This is not a stunt by Greenpeace or another NGO. This is something that was put at the Congress of the Renewable Energy Council, which is made up of the main European electricity utilities and companies that are involved in building renewable energy nowadays. And their target is 100% by 2050. And they're on target due to a mix of support from the private sector, support from public policy, although this is subject, there are controversial moves in this area at the moment, as you know, and support from civil society. This is really, when you compare the dream in 1975, when the Pompidou Center started and everybody had a, reluctance, to say the least, to this vision, and the reality of the facilities now. We are the move as the movement is in place. But one thing, as I mentioned earlier, that needs to take place is the elimination of harmful subsidies, especially in the fuel sector. It is easy to say that renewable is not economical if the proportion of subsidies that is given to the fossil fuel sector continues to be enormous. So what's the future for multilateral environmental agreements in this context? Well, let's face it, there is a fatigue for international processes. There is no doubt about this. But at the same time, there is a recognition that there is a limit of voluntary actions, including the action by civil society organizations and NGOs. And I always ask people to imagine the world nowadays if there was no multilateral environmental agreements. People who say, well, multilateral environmental agreements, treaty negotiations, international conventions, biodiversity, climate, etc., this is all boring, this does not work. Well, wait a minute. Imagine the world if there was no multilateral environmental agreements. And that's a scary thought. An even scariest thought is imagine the world without non-governmental organizations. And that's a scary thought also. All the steps that have been taken thanks to the action of NGOs, whatever their limitations are, whatever their biases are, has been phenomenal. And in order to look at the evolution of the last 40 years, we are just this year noting, I was going to say celebrating, I don't know if somebody will celebrate it, but noting that it is the 40th anniversary of the entry into force of the CITES Convention, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. One of the very first modern multilateral environmental agreement, which by and large has been a huge success. The CITES Convention, which is a convention that restricts international trade, is known as the Washington Convention. It was promoted back in the early 1970s by not only a U.S. administration, but a U.S. Republican administration. It was the Nixon administration, right? And it gives us an idea of the challenges that we have ahead of us, and I leave it with you like that. But think, imagine that nowadays the world would be looking at the possibility of restricting international trade in endangered species. I am afraid that it would be much more difficult to reach a consensus than it was in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, even with a Republican administration. So, last slide of that series. Who comes first? You know, where does the leadership come from? From public administrations, from private initiative, or from public mobilization? I think it's a bit a chicken and egg question. It comes from a combination of all of this. In certain cases, the lead comes from the public mobilization. Sometimes it comes from public administrations, and sometimes it's a private initiative. But the three segments feed each other and need each other to progress. So we're going to finish with a few basic concepts of strategic advocacy planning. But I'll start with a glass of water, if I may. Who sets the agenda? Is it the United Nations? Is it the G77? G77 within the United Nations because they have a majority? Is it, on the contrary, the big guys at the G7? Is it the G20 now that is taking over international trade agreements? Who sets the agenda? Is it the private sector? If so, within the private sector, private sector is not a monolithic entity. You have, if I may say, what I call the good guys, in accordance with my values, and you have the bad guys in accordance to environmental realities. Is it, for example, the Global Wind Energy Council that promotes wind energy, the development of wind energy around the world, or is it ExxonMobil, who has a long history of putting roadblocks on the way to renewables? Is it the fellows promoting organic farming, or is it the opposite, organizations and companies like Monsanto? Who's setting the agenda? Is it NGO coalitions, such as this one that was created around the time of the Copenhagen Climate Summit of 2009, or is it the Secretary General of the United Nations? I find these two images side by side interesting, because here you have the Secretary General of the United Nations, launching a campaign that is calling Seal the Deal, asking the general public to sign his petition before the 2009 climate summit. In other words, the United Nations Secretary General launches a petition just like the NGOs do. He realizes that without public support, he cannot deliver a climate agreement. Who sets the agenda? Maybe it's also the faith organizations. You may have heard or you may have read that apparently the Pope, Francis, is preparing what they call an encyclical about the environment, which is due to be issued this summer before the UN General Assembly, where I think is coming in September, and before the climate summit in Paris in November this year. It's not the first faith leader who's taking an initiative for the environment. You had within the Greek Orthodox Church, you have his name is Bartholomew, their leader who has been an environmental leader for many years. He's organized cruises in Antarctica, in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, and in the Amazon. Maybe it's time for faith leaders, and certainly it's time for faith leaders to take a stand. After all, that's what they call the creation, right? I had the privilege of being with a group at the Vatican nearly a year ago to discuss these issues with people from the Holy See. I think we should welcome the fact that faith leaders are taking a stand now and may help set the agenda that will have implications for billions of people, certainly. Who set the agenda? Is this man that is considered the most powerful man in the world? Anyway, that's what conventional wisdom is telling us. Or is it the voters that are setting the agenda? And of course, with social media in the middle. This line these three photos cannot be seen nowadays in isolation. Kofi Annan, who ran the United Nations for a number of years, said that non-governmental organizations are no longer seen only as disseminators of information, but as shapers of policy and indispensable bridges between the general public and the intergovernmental processes. And I think that it summarizes the role of advocacy organizations. It is, since its origin, the United Nations had envisaged that NGOs would have a role that was reflected in Article 71 of the UN Charter. Having said that, it is in recent times that NGOs, as Kofi Annan said, have moved from a situation of observers to real actors, non-state actors, as they're called. But with the proliferation of NGOs, NGOs themselves have their own challenges. For example, if you are a layperson, how do you distinguish between two different organizations who essentially have very similar activities? These two photos of two different development NGOs was taken on the same day, these photos of their website. And frankly, if I'm the layperson, which one do I choose? Oh, maybe I like the Mostazo green. I like this green color, or I'm stuck by the red background. I like this logo better than this one, or vice versa. But it's very difficult to make a choice. It's a bit like a Renault and a Fiat, right? It can take you from A to Z, roughly in the same amount of time for the same amount of money. And so, how do I choose? Do I buy a Renault or do I buy a Fiat? It's maybe, there are some very slight differences in design and color, but that's basically it. Same goes generally with all the different NGOs working within their respective areas. Look at WWF and Greenpeace. Same thing. Photos taken quite a while ago, but on the same day, and fish you can eat, fish you can eat. Red list, green list. It's basically the same thing. So, what do I support the panda or do I support the whale? It's all it has become a challenge for NGOs and for the general public. And it's even more confusing nowadays because corporations are also acting in the field of the environment. Sometimes they're claiming that they are, and sometimes they are visionary corporate leaders who are actually doing good things for the environment. This photo was taken a while ago, but here you have the airline industry saying that they found a more natural way to fly. They're building on the green agenda, and here you would have an NGO having a different discourse. I took these two photos on the same day, in the same place in Paris, in 2008. There was a summit. It was the 13th of July, the day before the 14th of July, France's National Day. And Sarkozy, who was the president of France at the time, gathered heads of state and government to, especially from the Mediterranean area, to create something that he wanted to call the Mediterranean Union, which I'm not exactly sure where it is now. But that was one of these initiatives that good ideas, but if they're not followed up, I'm not sure what happened. But so on the same day, I passed by the Parliament in Paris, and I found that Sarkozy, well, the French government, obviously not him personally, but was beaming on the Parliament messages about constructing sustainable development, and you see he's beaming windmills and a pledge to promote renewable energy all over the Mediterranean and all over the world. And on the same day, Greenpeace. That photo, I did not take it. I found it in the newspaper on that same day or on the internet. Greenpeace was climbing the Eiffel Tower with its own message. It was good. It was having an impact when Greenpeace was the only one beaming or climbing the monuments like the Eiffel Tower back, many years ago. But in a world where the government itself is using the monuments, there is a challenge for the environmental NGOs. In other words, the governments have endorsed the tactics that the NGOs themselves had adopted, and the NGOs therefore need to move forward because the attitude has become totally mainstream. in the same vein, now the United Nations are promoting renewable energy in the same way that, as I mentioned before, a minority of visionary people were in the past. The phenomenon of what I call UNGO is the fact that the United Nations are using also, just like many governments are as well, are using the same approach that the NGOs have been using for many years. The UN MDGs campaign, the Millennium Development Goals campaign of the United Nations is a good example. It's typically a campaign similar or just like the ones that NGOs are best at doing. As a matter of fact, the United Nations hired people from NGOs in order to develop their MDGs campaign with the websites and the public outreach typical of NGOs. UNAIDS in Geneva is another example. So it is great that governments, NGOs, corporations are endorsing the attitudes and the strategies of NGOs, but what does that mean for the NGOs? How can they continue to make a difference? I think that the answer lies with what I call Linux campaigning. You know the difference, because you're from the internet generation, you know the difference between Linux and Microsoft, right? I belong to a generation where we started with doing what I call Microsoft campaigning, and big campaigns with big brand campaigns. Greenpeace was an example when we built it of what we would call a Microsoft campaign. Big brand, well known all over the world, powerful at the time. Linux is open software, and nowadays, in a situation where everybody's understood how to make Microsoft, the equivalent of Microsoft campaigning, I think that what we need to do is the equivalent of Linux campaigning. So, for example, the global campaign for climate action, tac, 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 tick, 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 tac, 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 is an example. A huge coalition of people, not only made up of the usual suspects. There are faith organizations, there are trade unions, there are environmental organizations, development organizations. They all work together under one banner. That's what I call a Linux campaign. 350.org. I suppose you've run across them. It's another open software campaign organization. Ocean 2012, a coalition of organizations that worked to promote the reform of the European Union fisheries policy in a successful way. That's another example of an open software, open to all type of campaign. And I think that's what the future is telling us in a context where conventional NGO action has been endorsed by all. So what is a campaign? Well, a campaign is a connected series of operations that are designed to bring about a particular result, and a civil society campaign catalyzes the significant changes for public benefit. That's how we summarize it. It is an act of transformation. When we start a campaign, we have to ask ourselves some very basic questions. Are we ambitious Are we questioning the status quo? Are we going against business as usual? What is our vision? What is our long-term goal? And what is the road that we are going to take to accomplish this vision? And is there a broader impact? Are we going to set a precedent, change the paradigm, change the status quo? I'm using lately this old poster that was used back in the 1970s again in Paris, one of the first environmental campaigns in Paris. And the title says, "When you want, quand vous voudrez." And what is interesting is that in 1970, it was around 1975, 1976, it's proposing a model of Paris that again looked totally utopian at the time, with people sharing bicycles in the street, like now happens in most modern capitals, including Madrid recently. You see renewable energy, solar panels, pedestrian streets. Well, that's completely normal. It sounded totally utopian back in the 1970s, in the mid-1970s. I remember around that time that people were, respectable economists were even saying that it was impossible, it would be impossible to recycle paper because it would never be economic. And you see now what sounded utopian is the mainstream. And so when we look at building a campaign, we have to think how we're able to transform society. And one way to do it is through empowerment. Again, coming back to Anna, I very much prefer to use a word like empowerment than a word like lobbying. I don't know if anybody here among you is German. Is there any? You're German, so you know this guy, right? You remember this guy, yeah? And Jürgen Trittin. He was a green leader, and he was environment minister around, and that photo was taken in the year 2000, right? When there was that so-called, what was it called? Green-pink government, or green, yeah, green and social democrat government, right? And this photo was in at the meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which took place that year in 2000 in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And Greenpeace had empowered kids from all over the world that were called Kids for Forest, and all the different delegations of kids were going to their respective ministers. And this young woman, she must have been, what, I don't know, 15-year-old maybe, 14, 15-year-old, addresses Trittin. And you see that Trittin is looking at her in the eye, and she's looking at him in the eye. And I remember I was just behind. So I saw that moment. That's why I like this photo. And I saw that, Trittin thought, not only there are cameras, but I should listen to the new generation. That's something, he was like taking it pretty seriously. And for her, of course, to address the Minister of the Environment of her country at this big meeting, that was a big deal for her. And so it was a two-way empowerment. He was being empowered by the message from the youth, and the youth was being empowered by this meeting with the environment minister. So whenever I do that presentation in Germany, I always ask in the room, well, this young lady who's now, she must be 30-year-old, no? Is it you? It's not you? I always ask, hey, are you in the room? Because it was empowerment is a two-way street, and it was a very good example of a two-way street empowerment. Trittin was influenced, and she was influenced. And I'm just curious to know what she did in the end. But she discovered that she could do something. So, and that's how, that brings me to how campaigns catalyze changes. There are people who say, well, we have to work from outside the institutions. And there are people who say, we have to work from within the institutions. I think it's not a question of either or. You have to do both things. You have to do the insider's game, and you've got to do the outsider's game. And both approaches feed each other. If you just do one, you have limitations. I like this photo. It's from 2002, from the Johannesburg summit. I think I like it because it speaks to the need to have very simple messages to decision makers. That was the Johannesburg summit was a big deal, and it was a complicated negotiation that required a meeting of environment ministers that took place in Bali, in Indonesia, a few months, maybe 3 months before the summit. And we thought, well, how can we communicate our message to the ministers? And we prepared this little leaflet that was the size of a credit card, really, something you could put in your pocket or in your wallet. And it was asking a very simple question: why are you here? Why did you come to Bali? You came to save face, or you came to save the earth? You came to have a good time in Bali because it's a cool place with a cool beach, or you came to do your job as responsible for the future generations and for the environment. And that was, you know, very simple question, but somehow so simple that it was considered a bit provocative, and B, by many, well, that's the right question to ask, so much that when we came to Johannesburg 3 months later, the European Union had published, you see, exactly the same size, exactly the same format, a leaflet that was a copy, you know, intellectual property piracy. And it was saying, why is the European Union here? I think it talks, you know, to, you know, you provoke to create a reaction. Don't hesitate to provoke. And you must be an actor. You must remember that you are an actor and not an observer. This slide is tremendous. I took this photo in 2004 at United Nations headquarters at the Commission on Sustainable Development, which was a thing that at that time was meeting once a year. It's finished now. One of the good outcomes of the Rio +20 summit has been to decide to disband the Commission on Sustainable Development and to replace it with a body with more teeth. But these were the submissions, so to speak, by the NGOs. I was shocked when I saw that. And I think it's very important to remember that you are actors and you're not observers. And if you have a message, you better make sure that it comes across. And you use your creativity to do so. So 2 examples. At the meeting of the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna a few years ago in Paris, there was a big controversy about the status of bluefin tuna, you know, the biggest tuna, the largest tuna, the most expensive tuna, and they were going down the tube in the Mediterranean. So there was an opportunity to really get some measures to properly manage the bluefin tuna. And we had the idea of instead of doing this, to only give to all the ministers gathered, to give a crystal ball, and that was asking them not to do crystal ball science and not to use this crystal ball for bluefin tuna management. And, you know, immediately it created a reaction. I was told that Jane Lutsenko, who was at the time the head of the US National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, has had her crystal ball on her desk ever since when she was running the NOAA in Washington, D.C. Another example, Anna remembers it because she was there at the meeting of the International Whaling Commission in 2010 in the south of Morocco. We had anticipated that the weather would be warm, and also someone had the good idea to turn off the air conditioning. It was not me. And as soon as that took place, we distributed fans that were asking that the whales be given some space to breathe, right? And the head of the Japanese delegation was using his fan to survive and to carry the message that whales needed a breathing space, right? I think that's the attitude that NGOs, like a corporation, would think how to carry its message, that NGOs should take. But also, and that is very important, always thinking of the laypersons. I was involved, that was more than 10 years ago, I think, in a campaign to stop a fishing technique that is known as bottom trawling. That's huge nets that catch fish and catch so-called bycatch, unwanted species, and destroy vulnerable underwater habitats such as cold water corals, hydrothermal vents, etc. And there has been a discussion within the United Nations about what to do to control this activity, and we've gone a long way since this campaign was triggered. The initial demand was that there should be a moratorium on this practice that was unselective and destructive. So we asked people to send their ideas on how to communicate an issue that at that time was very complex and very new. How do you explain that, you know, bottom trawling is something you can't even see, that takes place at thousands of meters depth? There is no light, there is no camera. The best you can do is take a photo perhaps of a boat launching the nets, but very difficult to see the damage. Professionals of advocacy, advertisement companies, long-time activists, lifetime activists, everybody's been giving ideas. And finally, it's a fisherman who came up with the best image. You know, just a guy who's just a fisherman in Canada who stood in front of a bulldozer, and he wrote what this does to the land. That's the bulldozer. Bottom dragging, for some reason in Canada they say bottom dragging and not bottom trawling, does it to the oceans. And the guy just stood with a handwritten pom-pom, and he managed to create the image that all the professionals were unable to figure out. I mean, they gave us very fancy stuff, but nothing that was so straightforward as this. So always think of the laypersons and work with the laypersons, because the fact that they're so-called laypersons and they are not in the tunnel makes that they have very often the best ideas. And remember always that to be right is not enough, because if to be right was enough, well, we would not need to have advocacy campaigns such as the ones I've described. I just saw this morning actually on Twitter that the director of Amnesty International apparently said that he can't wait to see the time when Amnesty International is going to be obsolete and when they can close down the shop. Obviously, I don't think he'll see it in his lifetime, but that's the idea. So when you do campaigns, always make sure that you differentiate what a campaign is from a project. A campaign is a series of interventions on an issue towards a defined goals. And projects are the different interventions that make up the campaign. But too often we tend to stick with the project without keeping the big picture in mind. So it's a bit like it's a pizza or a quiche. I'm French, so I say a quiche. Any Italian? Anyone from Italy? Well, anyway, you all eat pizzas as well. So that's the project, and the whole pizza, the whole quiche is the campaign. Always remember that. And you need to connect them. And you need to have project cycles. While one project is underway, you prepare the second. You prepare your second project, third project. Generally, if you have resources, the best is to make sure that while one team is implementing project 1, another team is preparing project 2, and while you're phasing out project 1, project 2 moves underway, and project 3, etc., etc. It's a wave. Likewise, strategy and tactics are two different things. Strategy is the big picture, the principles, how you reach your goal. Tactics are the specific activities that you are undertaking in order to implement the strategy. We're here in Madrid, so there was in the past century, there was an eminent philosopher, Ortega y Gasset, who said, we don't know what's happening, and that's what's happening. And that's why I think that applies very much to the environmental crisis, and that's why we need strategies and not just tactics. And we need a critical path or a roadmap that maps out the steps that the campaign will follow over a specific time frame to achieve your goal. So when somebody comes to me, I'm a consultant, right? They come to me and say, well, I'd like to see if I can use your brain or your know-how. And I always tell them, well, tell me, what are the things that you'd like to know, the things you'd like to do, the things that you'd like to promote or create, and the things that you'd like to stop or to avoid, right? And most important, what do you want to be remembered for? Because you can't do everything in one shot, right? So what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want your contribution to be? I've mentioned a lot of international processes and instruments. And I would like to recommend to you, if Anna has not done it yet, that as people who are doing a master in international policy and are seeking to understand international processes and instruments, I recommend that you subscribe to the Earth Negotiations bulletins. at least in the areas you're most interested in. This is this fellow, Kimogori, the director of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. He's got a team that goes to every international meeting where sustainable development and environmental issues are being discussed, and they produce a daily bulletin. It's called an independent reporting facility, and it goes in first. As academics, you can become acquainted with the nitty-gritty, but if you don't have the time and you're only interested in the general dynamics, what I recommend you do is you go to the last page, and their bulletins always finish with a section that is called In the Corridors. And if you really want to know what's happening in international organizations, well, or some aspects of it at least, I recommend that you read the In the Corridors section, and you'll get a better picture. This one, I would not dare putting indispensable resource either, but you can follow what we're doing at the Varda Group, both through the website, through my blog, and of course you can follow me on Twitter and follow the Varda Group on Facebook. Thank you. So, do you want to go and eat, or do you want to? Anybody has any question, or I've just? It was so crystal clear that there is no question, or you're exhausted. Either way, Anna, I give you the floor back.
Thank you, Rémi, and thank you for all your thing. And well, just as a defense, I'm not the professor of the class on environmental policy. I just a humble environmental liability and lobby professor of the class. So that's why I didn't Earth Bulletin class. But I agree with you that this is a very basic resource for you to follow up. Thank you, Rémi. I think it has been a great recovery. So thanks again for the whole perspective that you have provided us. I think, I'm not sure if you gave them your email address. If not, I will give it. If you still have any doubt on how to put forward an environmental advocacy campaign, and they are shy because I gave them some questions for you. You're not doing some questions to Rémi. So, okay, he will escape your arms now. But thanks again for giving us the whole vision on how we can work on this matter from your perspective.